So, what do you think about how addiction is viewed in our culture? I would say that we are due for some up levels, some upgrades, some new ways of thinking. And Dr. Joshua Matthews brings you just this. You're going to want to listen as one of our holistic healers of Orange County goes into depth about his theory and how to put this into practice. It really sheds light and it changes the way that we see addiction and brings so much hope along with it. My name is Emily Sellis. I am the host for the Sage Holistic Show, and I am so glad that you're with us today, learning about healing and meeting new healers.
Sage is a 501c3 nonprofit organization building community by providing education and counseling about physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. We encourage all of our listeners to find their own path to what holistic wellness means to you.
Basically, I developed the theory of addiction and recovery as part of my doctorate degree. And it's like a hardcore science theory. It is, I really pride myself on being the best scientist I can be. And what that means is using the scientific method, where you go from like observation to hypothesis, and then you test those hypotheses through experiments. So basically, I developed these very technical theories of addiction and recovery. I sought about trying to answer the question of like, what is the fundamental nature of addiction and what is the fundamental nature of recovery? Now let's see here. Let me attempt a screen share with my PowerPoint. We'll see how this goes on this. Okay, you can see it, can you? Good. Okay. So basically, I call my theory the Multi-Dimensional Developmental Theory, the MDT of substance addiction and recovery. I am a psychotherapist. I live in Long Beach. I got a PsyD and a license as an MFT. Let's see. Okay, now why did I go about making this theory? Well, I did this because I'm not impressed with mainstream treatment and the models we have and the work that we're doing. And nothing against it. I worked in treatment for a long time, but I literally don't know anybody who's impressed with treatment. Like, I don't know anybody who's like, oh, we're killing it at drug addiction treatment in America. Like, we're really awesome. No. I mean, if you've got diabetes or something, or you have some other issue, like Western medicine is amazing. It fixes it and it's super effective. If we're doing physics and aerospace engineering, like, we're killing it at that stuff. But addiction treatment, it's what they call it, an opioid epidemic or whatever. It's a real epidemic. Treatment rates are low. Even though treatment centers will try to puff it up and try to say like, hey, we're getting decent results. Nobody's getting, I don't know. I've worked in a lot of treatment environments. I'd say 10% of people are sober a year later, something like that. It's not that impressive. And so what we've had is this disease model, this model that says that what addiction is this sort of like progressive, sometimes terminal brain disease. You have it. You're just suffering with this thing that you have, and that's why you can't control your behavior. And I won't get into like tearing apart the disease model here. I've got a whole PowerPoint on tearing apart the disease model, where just as a theorist, I blow the holes in it and why it isn't effective or why it's not theoretically sound. What I can say, though, is just that it's been around for decades, and we have not seen an appreciable improvement in addiction treatment. So my attitude is like, okay, if the disease model is presenting the most accurate understanding of reality, then that should yield results that are effective, right? But it doesn't. It is not doing that. Our treatment is not getting any better. And this paradigm that people are just like suffering with, like, I'm an addict forever. That's who I am. I'm an addict. I'm going to relapse. I have this brain disease. I'm not impressed. And so I did this study. Let me see if I pull my PowerPoint back up here for you. The screen share. Let's see here. So yeah, so what I did was I decided I would interview people who had recovered from addiction in all these different ways. They had all different types of addiction and all different types of recovery, and learn from them like what helped them and how they overcame addiction. And so that's how I developed this theory. I basically did all the hypotheses in my theory. are derived specifically from the data of these participants. I can show evidence for why I have every hypothesis in my theory from my data. This is sort of the rigor of grounded theory, this grounded theory methodology. It's kind of like old school science. Grounded theory is this sort of like old school science approach of like observing people, like saying, I don't know anything about this topic. Let me just observe people, take data from them, and then make connections, see how I can explain the data theoretically. And I intentionally picked people that had all these different forms of addiction and recovery, and wanted to explain how they recovered. And so that's how I did this. Let me move. My goal is to not get swamped down in the PowerPoint. I know I'm moving kind of quick, and I'm going to just breeze over the main theoretical constructs of this theory. Each theory, the theory of addiction and recovery, each has like 21 different hypotheses. The recovery theory has more than that, like 25. I'm not going to get into that. There's no way I can do that in 20 minutes. So if you go to my website, drjoshuamatthews.com, you can find my paper on there on addiction, like the actual theory paper. If you want to read my theory paper, knock yourself out. It's kind of long. It's fairly technical. Not many people want to read my theory paper. I encourage you to read my theory paper, but today I'm just going to kind of go for like the main things, like not the greatest hits or whatever, but like the things that really jump off the page with this theory. And that'll give you some food for thought. So let's see, we're like probably 6 minutes in now. Let me move right into some of this stuff here. Okay, so but the basic hypothesis here is that addiction is not a disease of the brain, but it's a developmental process somebody's engaged in. Okay, this developmental process is multi-dimensional. Okay, so it's happening in multiple dimensions of a person's life. And a dimension of somebody's life is like their relationships, their psychology, their spirituality, their occupation. We develop in different what Ken Wilber would call different lines of development. Okay, these dimensions of development. And my hypothesis is that addiction is ultimately a multi-dimensional developmental process that's happening it's organized around this relationship that somebody has with a particular drug. They develop this attachment to this drug, and it starts to shape multi-dimensional development. By the way, one dimension is neurobiology. So one dimension is indeed the brain. The biology is a dimension. Here's the main difference, though. Well, there's a lot of differences, but a primary difference is what the disease model does is it says biology is king. Biology is central. Of all of these dimensions, imagine the solar system with the sun in the middle. The disease model says that the brain is the sun. Everything revolves around that. All your behavior problems as a drug addict are because you have a brain disorder. I say neurobiology is only one of multiple dimensions. I pull it out of the middle, and it's now one of multiple dimensions that is dynamically interacting with each other. In the center is the relationship somebody has with the drug. That is the sun. So what I'm doing is saying neurobiology is as much the effect of change in other dimensions as it is the cause. And I think this is actually supported by research. Research is showing that like how we think actually shapes our neurochemistry. Our relationships, cause oxytocin to release in our brain. The things that we do for fun shape our brain chemistry. So I basically say biology isn't king. And I make the case that really the medical model thinks biology is king because medicine is biology. Realize medicine says everything is biology. Of course they were going to think that it was a brain disease because they look at everything as biology centric. Anyway, so that's my basic hypothesis, that addiction is this multidimensional change process. Likewise, I hypothesize that recovery is a multidimensional change process, that what's happening in recovery is basically all the ways that somebody develops in a negative way during their addiction. They start to become more selfish. They start to like function poorly at their job. They become more irritable and impatient in their relationships. Like they're having all this downward negative development, right? We all see this. We see this with drug addicted people. My hypothesis is that what recovery is ultimately is growing in the opposite direction. So recovery is development. And in my model, people, I'll get to some of the real takeaways here that I know I'm totally breezing through the theory because I want to get to some of the other stuff. My theory says basically that people can fully recover from addiction. So the current model says you're an addict forever. It says that you have an addiction, you are a quote unquote addict, and you're always going to be that way. The goal of mainstream treatment is to achieve a remission state. I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but it's to achieve a remission state where you're always in remission. You're always an addict who might relapse. You're never recovered. You're always in recovery. My model says that that's not true for people. People can fully recover from addiction. Not only can they fully recover from addiction, but in all those dimensions where they have recovered, they can transcend who they ever were before addiction. So they could actually transcend the recovery process. So in my model, people are not limited by either being an addict for the rest of their life or being in recovery for the rest of their life. Okay. So now how does this work? What I hypothesize is that we can examine the developmental process within each person. I call this the fingerprint of addiction. That there's a fingerprint, a multi-dimensional developmental fingerprint. Each person's addiction is unique to them. It is this thing that we can actually, as clinicians, analyze the way somebody changed while they were, drug addicted. By the way, in my model, there are no addicts. I don't call anybody a drug addict. There's just addicted people. And that's because in my model, it's a developmental process. It's not something you have. It's not your core. It's not who you are as a human being. You're not an addict at your core. You're actually, what I say is you're quote unquote engaged in a multidimensional process. You're engaged in this developmental process. So you have some responsibility over it. You don't just have addiction. You're not afflicted. You are engaged in a multidimensional process. And what I say is we can examine the way people changed during addiction. And then we can devise a treatment plan that basically focuses on human development. We say recovery isn't about time. It's not you trying to achieve 10 years of sobriety. It's you growing and developing in healthy ways in multiple dimensions of your life. And what I basically say is we can quantify how recovered somebody is. So this is an idea I want you to consider. So these are some sort of key takeaways here. The hypothesis, and I structure everything as a hypothesis. And I sort of, as I move forward into trying to sort of get this theory out there, I take pride in being a real scientist. And what that means is I'm not trying to convince you this is true. I would say disbelieve, regard everything I say with total skepticism and an open mind. These are hypotheses. Try to figure out how the hypothesis is wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a better hypothesis, right? So what I'm hypothesizing is people can fully recover from addiction. And what I also hypothesize is that we can quantify how much progress they've made. So currently everybody's just in recovery, and the only way we measure progress is time. We basically say, okay, you're more recovered than that person because you're a year sober, or you're 5 years sober. That's status, right? In recovery is your time sober. I'm saying time is just a byproduct of multidimensional development. We can actually measure using measures that may not exist yet, some that exist and some that don't. But we can measure someone's human development in recovery. And we could say the conversation becomes, oh, you're 45% recovered psychologically. You're 80% recovered relationally because you've made these changes in your life. And people can recover in each dimension fully. So the idea is you could fully recover physically from addiction. And then the goal becomes, okay, transcend your previous level of wellness. So you've recovered physically, and now as therapists, we help you transcend that. Self-actualization, help you actualize your growth in multiple dimensions. So what I hope is in the future, we can have a situation where people aren't talking about, I'm an addict forever and I'm in recovery forever, but like, I have a game plan. I'm gonna work with my therapist or my other professionals and or my layperson community, my support group, and develop in the ways that I need to develop so that like I resolve whatever was there in the first place. So my basic hypothesis is that the multidimensional developmental process is the fabric of addiction. That developmental process, we can't see it. It's the invisible architecture. Maybe it exists and maybe it's seen in higher dimensional consciousness somehow, but we can't see it. It's a developmental process. My argument is that is the nature of addiction. That is what it is. The more you grow out of it in recovery, the more you disintegrate. You disintegrate the multidimensional developmental process of addiction step by step as you grow in recovery. The more you grow, the less there is of what there was. Full recovery is when you've grown multidimensionally such that the fabric of your addiction is disintegrated. In other words, the reasons, maybe your addiction for each person is different. Maybe it was about trauma. Maybe it was about your marriage being a disaster. Maybe it was about childhood issues. Maybe it was about your existential crisis, right? When each person works through whatever they work through, then the thing that was their addiction isn't there and they can achieve full recovery. Okay, that's that. You're flying along. I think I've got like 5 minutes here. Okay, let me quickly consult my PowerPoint here. I'm just going to do this without sharing it. I'll quickly share this with you. Okay. This is a graph I made where you can see basically it's these are dimensions of development. I have equations in my theory. Don't be scared. These aren't mathematical. I'm not good at math either. These are heuristic formulas. So my equation at the top says the degree of substance addiction is a function of the degree of development. So what I'm basically saying is severity. When we talk about severity, severity is a function of how developed you went in the wrong way. Severity is a function of development. So on my graph, you see it also goes upward. What I allow is we can chart the beneficial elements of a person's addiction. Maybe you all are on here. That's the other thing I'm saying, is that there is no clear line between the addict and the non-addict. As soon as you develop a relationship with a mind-altering drug, you start to change multidimensionally. Maybe it's just your coffee habit. Maybe your coffee habit has you moving, if you look on there on the top line, occupationally, maybe there's benefit to your coffee addiction occupationally. You're moving just a little bit upwardly, helps you focus and get your job done. At the same time, maybe that coffee addiction is making you more irritable. Maybe you're not as good with your partner when you get home because you're all jacked up on caffeine and you're less sensitive interpersonally. Maybe your coffee addiction is causing you in the realm of spirituality and the realm of the psycho-emotional. Maybe you're developing downward a little bit because of your coffee addiction. So this model allows us to basically map every person's addiction, the benefit and the detriment of it. This becomes their fingerprint of addiction. Each person's on this graph somewhere. So that's that. Okay. We'll have time for questions in just a moment. I wanted to talk about the relationship. Okay, so full recovery is possible. The other thing that's different about this theory is I make the case that abstinence is a myth. That the current abstinence model, I think, is a bit of a joke. In mainstream treatment in our country, we are abstinence-based. It's all about abstinence. My argument is that nobody's actually sober. What we've done is created these socio-political lines between what drugs count as drugs and what drugs don't. You can drink coffee and you can be on Prozac and Suboxone and still be sober, but you can't take mushrooms twice a year in a sacred ceremony. I think that's ridiculous. That's not science. That's basically saying we are letting our religion and culture and politics and medical model obscure our vision of reality. My hypothesis is that all that matters is the effect of a drug on somebody's human development. If you're in recovery and you are taking a drug, the question is, how does this impact your actual multidimensional recovery process? If some drugs work good for some people, some drugs don't. I would hypothesize that most people drinking caffeine in a treatment center shouldn't be drinking caffeine because it's making them more anxious. They already have a dysregulated neurochemistry from all the sedatives and alcohol they were using. They have a high stress environment. Why are we giving them an anxiogenic drug, an anxiety generating drug like caffeine? Doesn't make any sense. I would say the only reason we are giving people those drugs in treatment is because we don't know any better, and because we don't know that they're drugs. So my theory basically hypothesizes that all of these socio-political lines about which drugs count and which drugs don't matter at all. Now, this is inconvenient for the law. If my theory comes around and says, hey, certain illegal drugs might be great for somebody's recovery and certain legal drugs are not, and just because your doctor prescribes it, your Prozac might not be as good as taking ayahuasca. Mescaline might be better than Ativan, or it might be worse. This is highly inconvenient for mainstream treatment and for the law. But like I say, I pride myself on being the best scientist I can be and giving the clearest look at reality I can. So I would say this model looks at abstinence very flexibly. In this model, we basically go, okay, you think you can use drugs or substances when you're sober? Let's talk about how those substances impact you. And by the way, like when I do therapy with people, like I look at everything. Just because they're coming in with their caffeine and their vaporizer addiction doesn't mean that that's okay for recovery. So that's the gist of it. It's very flexibly oriented. The model's very optimistic. It says, let's help you transcend and change and grow. And if you think you can use substances, let's be open-minded and skeptical and investigate why you think you can use certain substances in your recovery. So I'll leave it at that. I think we're at about 20 minutes. So I'll leave it at that and open it for any questions or discussion that you want.
Thank you so much for being mindful of the time. I think we're going to have a lot of questions. I'm seeing some stuff in the chat here. Let's see. Grace is saying, is there a physical line on that graph? It was pretty small on my screen, so I couldn't see it. So I don't know how you would answer that. A physical line?
There is the physiological line. You can see it here. Yeah, there is the physiological line, which includes neurobiology. So this model doesn't say that neurobiology it doesn't say the findings of the disease model are bogus. Like, I absolutely understand brain changes occur. I make a hypothesis that the brain disease model misunderstands neurobiology. The brain disease model has a crude and simplified version of neurobiology. It's outdated. They're looking at the brain chemistry driving everything else. They're not up on the latest research in consciousness and meditation and psychology, which shows that like brain chemistry is actually affected by how you're thinking and your experiences. It's a two-way street. So I basically say neurobiology exists. We just need to look at it in a more modern neuroscience kind of a way.
Thank you for spending some of your time today with us at Sage Holistic Health and Wellness Center. If you like what we're all about, please consider supporting our nonprofit organization by making a tax-deductible donation. To do this, you can go to our website at www.sagewellnessctr.org and click on Donate in the upper right-hand corner. We look forward to spending some time again with you real soon. Take good care.